Brilliant. Great. If everyone is just coming in, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to our online audience. It's fantastic to see so many people, and thank you so much for making the time at what I know is an incredibly busy period, and also when it is so warm here in Brussels. My name is Dora Meredith, and I am the director of ODI Europe, which is a global affairs think tank based here in Brussels, which is focused on bringing the global perspective into the Brussels debate. We work with colleagues based in London, DC, and around the world. We are really happy that we collaborate with UN Women on this series called the Gender Talks. This is a regular event that we do throughout the year on a number of different topics to make sure that issues of gender equality and inclusion remain high on the political agenda, and to really create this forum for discussion and debate. So really lovely to see you all today, and please do join in the discussion and discuss with us. So to kick off, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Vishnja Vachanovic. I hope I pronounced that right, Vishnja. And she is the Regional Gender and Governance and Good Governance Advisor at UN Women. Vishnja, thank you for giving the opening remarks.
Thank you very much. On behalf of UN Women Brussels office, I would like to warmly welcome you in UN House here in Brussels. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion. And as Dora mentioned, this is a part of a series of dialogues on gender equality, including both urgent threats, but also emerging opportunities to advance gender equality, not only within the EU, but also beyond. Just a couple of technical remarks before we begin. We'll be taking a photo, so if you prefer not to appear in them, please let us know. And of course, the event is also being recorded and will be made available on ODI website shortly after the event, so you will be able to see it. This afternoon, we will be exploring how to ensure that gender equality is firmly placed at the center of financial decisions. We will reflect on the types of investments that are needed to deliver on the normative, political, and financial instruments that we already have in place to strengthen gender equality commitments. Importantly, we will also discuss how gender equality can and must remain a core priority in the EU external actions, development cooperation, and multilateral partnership, including budget allocation. To open today's conversation, I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Susan Ferguson, Special Representative for UN Women Afghanistan. We are truly honored to have her with us today, since she brings decades of experience in advancing gender equality and social justice, having worked across Australia, India, South Africa, Papua New Guinea, and also Solomon Islands. Her leadership in both grassroots initiatives and international development policy brings a unique perspective to the challenges and opportunities we are discussing today. Susan, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope, can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. And thank you to you, Dora, and ODI colleagues. It's actually a real honor for me to speak here because I've always been full of admiration of ODI. And in fact, when I worked in Papua New Guinea, ODI did this really important study about the impact, the economic cost of violence against women in that country. So it's great to be here today, and it's lovely to be here with my UN Women colleagues. Also my Afghanistan women colleagues who are also in the room. So we in the Afghanistan country office are in a perfect storm today. Geopolitics are changing each day, affecting member states' priorities and their focus. Many member states have run out of patience with the slow pace of change in countries like Afghanistan, where change is often incremental. There have been major cuts to aid globally, which have amounted to a 30% cut in our Afghanistan country office funding. And many of our programs are also finishing at the end of the year. Even without the aid cuts, we would have been, financing and looking for finance again towards the end of the year. But due to the above points I've already said, that's actually really difficult to refinance what we're doing. But what does this mean for women and the girls we work with in Afghanistan? It's by no means the first, nor by any means the biggest storm that women in Afghanistan have already faced. But what we've learnt from them is that doubling down on gender equality and women's rights isn't negotiable. It's an essential part of providing humanitarian assistance to all. And it's also mandatory for meeting basic needs and growing a country at peace with itself and its neighbours. It's essential for women, girls, men, and boys. As a result of humanitarian funding cuts this year in Afghanistan and beyond UN Women specifically, OCHA has documented that the UN has had to suspend 115 gender-based violence service delivery points, affecting more than 1 million women survivors. Protection services for 3.3 million people have also been cut, including 1.6 million children. These services include case management for survivors of violence, psychological support for those who have experienced trauma, emergency victim assistance, explosive ordnance risk education, and cash interventions. 12 out of 23 community resource centres have also closed, affecting an estimated 120,000 people, and approximately 47% of these are women and girls. Within UN Women itself, we're very lucky in that the EU has generously provided bridging support to cover some of these reductions, particularly so that we're able to continue some of our support to survivors of violence. But when this runs out, we will have to close down that support. With these, that means that over 100,000 women won't be able to access GBV services. And we urgently need other member states to come in behind the EU and behind UN Women to continue to fund these important services in the country. A couple of weeks ago, UN Women staff met with a group of women in Kunar in northeastern Afghanistan, and many of them were survivors of gender-based violence. They'd participated in women's rights training, which is still able to be carefully delivered in Afghanistan by local organisations who understand how to navigate the context, and with our support. These women told us how they shared, what they learned with their husbands and with their in-laws, who in some cases actually began to change their behaviour. But another really profound shift for these women was within themselves. They told us we're women, but we didn't know about our rights. It opened our minds and we're now more confident. So this is where the spark of change can ignite at the grassroots, in the community and in the homes amongst and between men and women. So we really have a choice here whether we let these sparks die out or whether we keep them alive. And we need financing to do that. These things don't happen by themselves. Under our partnership with the European Union, UN Women Afghanistan is focused on 3 urgent goals. First, delivering essential multi-sectoral services at the grassroots for and with crisis-affected women and girls, including those who've suffered violence or at risk of violence. Second, we convene and we intervene and we advocate with national and international decision makers on gender equality and women's empowerment. And third, we help amplify the voices of Afghan women and women-led organisations to shape policies and programs within the UN system, externally and internationally as well. And we do this through partnerships with women-led organisations on the ground. Organisations that, as I said earlier, are finding ways to navigate and overcome the many overlapping constraints that they face. So this locally led approach is really essential. Because in a context like Afghanistan, where women and girls face near total restrictions on their lives, women-led and women-focused organisations are among the few actors still able to deliver trusted, community-based and sustainable solutions. These organisations are essential and they're indispensable agents of change within these organisations. So I think we need to change the way we look at this. This is not a cost so much as an investment in the women of Afghanistan, their families and communities, and a broader investment for the world, actually, in a safe and peaceful Afghanistan. As our executive director says, where afforded the opportunities, which are their right, women's contributions are game-changing. And yet we're denying them these opportunities. Of the 14 indicators under SDG 5, which is about gender equality, only 2 are close to target today. The remaining 12 are well off track. She further says gender equality is not only goal 5, it's the great enabler for every sustainable development goal. So we cannot end poverty without investing in care. We cannot build peace without women at the table, and we cannot protect the planet while excluding half the world's population. So why aren't we investing? Why is there a $420 billion global gender financing gap for women? Why has ODA to women's organisations dropped nearly 30% in just 2 years? And why is less than 1% of all ODA going directly to women's organisations and movements? This is happening at a time when the chance of achieving gender equality hangs in the balance. This financing gap isn't new. It's not just the last few years where there's been a gap. It's exacerbated at the moment, but it's existed for a long time. And those of you like me who've been involved in international development work for a long time will see that this is a long-term issue. There is not enough investment in gender equality and women's empowerment. Why aren't we investing? My own perception is that in a world where aid is necessarily rationed, decision makers are still not convinced that investments in women's agency and services are a fundamental enabler, as our executive director says. I think there's still a lack of belief that it is still really critical. One of my sort of heroes from many years ago is Anne-Marie Gertz, who found in her research a long time ago that feminist development workers are like Trojan horses. They bring their analysis and commitment to the development project to ensure investment in women's empowerment and to protect investments. This is actually why UN Women is an important partner within the UN system. We are more than a technical partner. We have an analysis of the contested world of aid that values and holds space for investments in women's agency. This is also why investing in women-led organisations is crucial. Thun and Weldon's research in 2012 found that the single most important factor in driving the change to end violence against women was the existence of a strong and autonomous women's movement. I'm sure you've all heard about that research. And even older research done by Esther Duflo in India in 2004 shows that when women entered local panchayats, it's a local level government, in India, through special measures adopted by the Indian government at the time, investments in the quantity and quality of health and education services improved, for example, as women began to shape budgets according to what they felt was important because of their experiences as women. Actually, today, India has by far the largest cohort of women political leaders at the local level, with over 1.4 million women in these positions, built on these special measures. And now the government has introduced special measures in national parliament for 33% women in national parliaments as well. So that's why also the upcoming financing conference is really important, that women be at the table of these decisions. And it's an opportunity to recommit and reinvest in gender equality. Afghan women and girls everywhere demand and deserve nothing less. So in closing, I just want to let you know that we've done some research about women's position in Afghanistan called the Gender Index. We have some cards out the back. You might like to have a look at that. And that will, I think, convince you of the importance of continuing to invest in women and girls in Afghanistan. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to finish there. Thank you again so much.
Thank you ever so much, Susan, for really giving us such a great opening and for, I think highlighting the urgency of the situation there. So thank you. It gives me great pleasure to now pass on to MEP Marit May, who is the Shadow Rapporteur for the European Parliament report Financing for Development, ahead of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development in Seville. I hope that you can hear us okay, Marit. And I would like to start by asking you, what are your expectations for the conference, particularly on, reflecting on some of the things that we've just heard there? Ooh, I hope you can hear us. And if not, we might have to... Slight technical situation. What I suggest we do is perhaps move on to the panel, and then we will bring, oh no, here we are. Can you hear us?
Yes,
Oh,
I can hear you.
wonderful.
My apologies.
No problem at all.
Let me turn
please.
off the camera because the connection is really bad. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
So it was just the question on your expectations for the conference.
Yes, well, let me start by saying that I really appreciate the introduction that Susan gave us, that gives us a view on the necessity of the gender equality and the gender aspects in the programs and in the collaboration that we have also with the Global South. I think it's very important to listen to these testimonies and to listen to the necessity of what organizations like UN Women and others do on the ground to make sure that women can fully participate in societies. As you might have known, if you might have followed, we had the vote on our, I'm sorry, I'm at a train station, I'm a little bit distracted. We had the vote on the Finance for Development report from the European Parliament this week on Tuesday. And unfortunately, we did not have a majority for this proposal and for our report, which is something to not be too optimistic about. But at the same time, your question was, what are your expectations for the conference, particularly regarding financing for gender equality? And I must say that my expectations for the conference are not that negative. If I look at the draft that has been produced, the draft text that was negotiated between the partners on the UN level in New York, I think it's very important that we see that there is a lot of language, progressive language, and language that gives us the good angle to work on gender mainstreaming and gender responsive budgeting. At the same time, we see that for the meeting in Seville itself, the role of the European Union will be limited. And we, as a European Parliament, we will participate, but we will participate without an institutional position representing us in the from the European Parliament. So this, I think, is much more of a problem than it seems to be at first sight, because like I said, the text itself of the conference and the expectations for the conference as such are relatively positive. But at the same time, if we see that the European Union and especially the European Parliament at this moment is not able to come to a text and an opinion that is also supporting this kind of activities, that is supporting gender responsive budgeting, that is supporting gender mainstreaming, I think then we have a challenge. And this is a challenge which I think we have to face, but we have to work on. Because at the same time, we see that the members of the European Parliament, we have recently visited the DRC, Congo, with a broad delegation, including a delegation from those parties and those political groups that voted against this report, participating in a number of activities in the DRC, also working on gender-based violence, looking at the position of women, looking at the position of the healthcare for women, psychosocial care for women. And there we see that everyone thinks it's important that we work on that, so that we take steps. At the same time, it's a little worrying that when we propose these steps for a text for the European Parliament and for the financing for development, we see that this is troublesome. So if you ask me in general, what is my expectation for the conference? I think the expectation for the conference can be positive because the text as such is positive. But I am a little bit worried about what the position of the European Parliament and of the European Union is going to be. Also looking forward at the multi-annual financial framework, which is coming up in and the negotiations about the multi-annual financial framework that are coming up, where I think we were going to have tough discussions on the international cooperation elements and funds in the budget, on what Global Gateway will be, on how Global Gateway, this new program that was introduced, or this new heading maybe, or umbrella that was introduced 2 years ago by the European Commission, will advance development for all the SDGs. Because this is, of course, what we are looking at right now, the Sustainable Development Goals ending our trajectory in 2030. And so little of these goals have been achieved. And I think I didn't completely hear the introduction of Celia, but I think we also should also mention, and of course UN Women also mentions often, that SDG 5 and the other elements of the SDGs which are gender related are very much underperforming, under budgeted and underfunded. And we need more funding for these elements. We need more funding for women-led organizations and for the general element of looking at budgets from a gender perspective, from a gender mainstreaming perspective. So I think here we have a sort of, well, the balance I think would be that I think for the upcoming conference, we can be relatively positive, but at the same time, I do have my worries for what will come next, and especially for what will come next in the budget of the European Union and its member states, as we have seen that the United States is cutting heavily, and is also focusing its cuts on elements that are important for gender budgeting and gender mainstreaming. And we have to see what will happen in the next years also in the European Union and in the Netherlands. Sorry, in the member states, including, of course, my own member states. So thank you very much for, I hope, I cannot hear you, I cannot see you at this moment. I hope you were able to listen to, well, our first reflections. I must say that we prepared some elements for a discussion. I didn't expect the report not to pass. I expected the report to be maybe watered down a little bit. So in that sense, yeah, we are also still a little bit surprised and are trying to analyze what this means for our position in the European Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic picture of where we are, and I think we're going to delve into some of those topics now, and hopefully we can come up with some ideas, you know, amongst us on how we, you know, what we might do next. Brilliant. I'm going to move us onto the panel discussion, but it would be great, Marit, if you could stay on the line, as I think we've got another follow-up question for you.
I can try.
That's wonderful. So I'm just going to introduce the panel, and I'll actually change microphones to do that. So let's go over here. Can you hear me? Ooh, a bit of echo. Is that working online? Yes, all good. Brilliant. Then we'll kick off. Hopefully everyone can hear me in the room. So I'd like to introduce to the stage Mari Tempesta, who's the advocacy advisor of the IPPF European Network. Mari, would you like to come and join me? Thank you. Then Julieta Gonzalez, who is the director and EU representative of CARE International. Julieta, very nice to see you. Sorry, I'm just going to pop that down. Then online, we've got Jennifer Solotaroff, who is the Senior Social Development Specialist in the Europe and Central Asia team at the World Bank. Jennifer, I hope that you can hear us.
I can hear you fine. There we go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And finally, Sophie Effange, who's the Associate Vice President for Policy at the Equality Fund. Sophie, thank you so much for joining us. That's great. Brilliant. So what a fantastic panel. Really grateful to all of you for your time, and really looking forward to discussing some of these topics which have just been mapped out so well. So I think actually firstly, Marit, if I could come back to you just to ask a little bit more about, you know, you mentioned the MFF, you mentioned kind of some of the possible debates that are coming up. I wondered how you saw, you know, particularly the Global Gateway and the challenges that the EU is currently navigating in terms of mobilizing funding for gender equality in the context of its new approach to partnerships. So how do you see the things like the Global Gateway working in terms of gender equality?
I think we have to see from the analysis that have been done by various organizations, including yourself. We see that it is a challenging program. From what we understand from the ground and also from the people at INSPA and in the embassies that we've talked to in the delegations, Global Gateway mainly focuses on infrastructure and on improving economic ties between the European Union and particular countries. And if I look at a number of countries, for example, in Africa that we've worked with, or also in Latin America that are full of critical raw materials, we see that this is one of the focus areas as well, to make sure that we, as a European Union, also have access to those critical raw materials, which is a thing that, of course, we understand, because without those critical raw materials, we would not be able to do this conference online, and also myself from my iPhone. So, you know, we need these to work in our digital world. We need these to also work in our world for more sustainability and a less decarbonized world. But at the same time, we see that we still have not found the solutions on how to do that in such a way that it doesn't harm the countries in the global south, and specifically communities living around these areas that we like so much. And here, if we work on that in a proper way, if we work on, let's say, mining policies and policies in infrastructure and in other maybe areas that are linked to those economies, if we do that in a proper way, if we include the gender angle, if we include the specificities of women living in these areas, of female workers in these, for example, in mines or in other infrastructure elements, I think we can move forward. But we really need to understand that if we do this more economic programming from the angle of the Global Gateway with our partners in the Global South, we need to include elements of gender budgeting. We need to include elements of gender responsiveness and look at the specificities of female and women workers and women living in those areas. And I think this is still lacking. So if you now focusing on Global Gateway, I think there are opportunities. There are definitely opportunities to improve this. But at the same time, we see that this is still not on the forefront and not in the first line. And then if I come back to this, well, to the DRC, we see that a lot of gender-based violence is linked to the economics of the country, is linked to the mining and the wealth of critical raw materials of this country. Same happening in other countries in the Global South. So I think there, if we want to, I think we can introduce these elements if we do that properly, also in the Global Gateway programming, and then we can maybe use it for the better and not just for economic profit on our side.
Great, thanks, Marit. Marie, I'm going to come to you next, as you also are doing a lot of work on the MFF as part of the Concord Task Force. Could you tell us, in terms of the discussions you've been having with that task force, what do you think the MFF needs to do to be truly gender transformative? And then maybe building on what Marit said there.
Yes, is it working? Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I today represent IPPF, but also Concord. Well, in an ideal world, my first recommendation would be the MFF needs to be based on feminist principles, which would mean it needs to protect human rights, to allocate funding to gender equality, of course, but also to correct power imbalances, address systemic oppression, and promote collaboration over competition in external affairs. I think we will all agree in that room, we are not living in an ideal world, and that seems quite unreachable at the moment. But the very basis should be at least having a gender budgeting approach to the new MFF. This means making sure that gender equality is included in all pillars of the new MFF, all programs, all budget lines, and at all stages. So meaning gender is there from the very conception to the monitoring and evaluation of the funding. On top of gender budgeting, I think there are 4 key things that I would like to highlight today in terms of making the MFF gender transformative. The first one is the gender equality targets. The EU has set up for itself gender targets in the past, in the current actually MFF and the current NDICI, and in the gender action plan. We see this as absolutely critical to make sure that gender equality is actually funded. We even believe that these 2 targets should even be strengthened by being measured not in terms of number of programs, but in terms of ODA. So that's why we are calling on the European Commission to include in its proposals in July, in the next NDICI, a target of 85% of ODA going to G1, so the gender equality marker of the OECD, meaning gender mainstreaming basically, and 20% of ODA going to gender targeted actions, because we believe that gender targeted actions need to be more funded to achieve gender equality. The second aspect that I would like to highlight today is the role of women's rights organizations. They are absolutely key to move the needle on gender equality, and they are desperately underfunded. This is why in our position within Concord, we call for a dedicated target of 5% of ODA going directly to women's rights organizations, especially, of course, local women's rights organizations. This is the only way that these organizations will have access to core long-term funding and will be able to do their work. The third recommendation is to keep the thematic budget lines. In the current NDICI, there are thematic budget lines that allow to fund gender equality, especially the TSO budget line, the human rights one, and the global challenges one. These are the budget lines with which the EU has been able to fund UNFPA for SRHR, for example, UN Women as well, women's rights organizations, organizations defending LGBTI rights, and human rights in general. This is absolutely key, and this needs to stay in the next development aid instrument. And last but not least, the fourth aspect that has been really important to ensure a gender transformative NDICI and will be important in the next MFF is to make sure that the programming is aligned with the gender action plan, so policy and funding together. The fact that the last programming process was aligned with the adoption of Gender Action Plan 3 really helped EU delegations to prioritize gender equality in their funding, and this is absolutely important. So we really hope that the Gender Action Plan 4 will be adopted slightly before the programming process starts, so that EU delegations are empowered to really promote gender equality and fund gender equality. And just let me conclude by saying these recommendations can seem a bit dry and technical, and it's very easy to lose sight of why we're advocating and what we're advocating for. I think we need to remember that what we're advocating for is for funding to go where it's needed. People, women, girls, marginalized communities in the global majority world, they have the courage, they have the spirit, they have the skills, the expertise to fight for a better world for everyone, for an equal world. They just need funding because we live in a capitalist system and you need funding to achieve things. So this is our fight. We fight for them to make sure that the funding is going where it's needed.
Thank you very much, Marie. I know you've got to leave a little bit early, so please do leave when you need to, but thank you very much for those really concrete and clear messages, which I think is great to hear. Giulietta, can I come to you? Could you tell us a little bit about how you see the EU's kind of future approach? How do you think it can be embedding gender equality priorities into its approach to partnerships?
Yes, there I am. Yes, thank you very much to you and to the colleagues of Young Women for the invitation. I think this is a very, very timely and relevant discussion, given all the processes that are taking place while we speak. I think that, and already Marie mentioned, so the EU under the NDICI Global Europe instrument comes with a series of commitments to deliver both on human development and on gender equality across the EU's international and development cooperation. So my first very direct, if you want, answer to you is that actually the EU should be delivering all those commitments across the board, but then especially including Global Gateway, I think Marie mentioned the need also to strengthen the inclusion of both human development and gender equality in this new EU's strategy. I think so. We have seen many projects also, as Marie was mentioning, not necessarily including these aspects. So we do believe that they must contribute to them, and also Global Gateway projects specifically should be assessed upon their contribution to these commitments. I think we have been discussing, especially in Brussels level and with the European Commission in the last months, the so-called 360 degrees approach to Global Gateway. We do see that this is a good opportunity to ensure the integration of both human development and gender equality. We do know that Global Gateway, for example, already includes some aspects in relation to health and to education as part of their investment priorities, yet What we haven't seen is this approach being systematically integrated into the project design and the project implementation. So one of the recommendations that is also based on a report that Concord produced a couple of I think last summer. Yes, we think that the rights-based approach should be central to the development of the projects, but also the EU should be systematic in integrating and in investing in human development and gender equality strategies. Then, in addition to these top-level commitments, and as part of the work, we have a SCARE in our programs across the world. So we were thinking about a series of more concrete actions that could be taken forward in this framework. So one could be also supporting investments in women-owned and women-led businesses to advance women's economic justice and supporting them to have equitable access to resources, finance, and decision-making power. What does it mean for Global Gateway? Probably partnering and then investing more in supporting local, small and medium-sized enterprises, also that are led by women. So when I was reading several of the reports we have of our programs, we also have some data that, for example, across the African continent, 24 of women in Africa are actually involved in entrepreneurial activities. But that's an average percentage. Then in some countries, this reaches the 50%. And if I remember well, for example, one of the countries was Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So that's quite interesting data, I thought. Then across the life cycle approach of gender of Global Gateway projects, so from the design to the implementation of the projects, one of our key messages have been to conduct sex disaggregated data analysis and needs assessments. So we need to understand where women are in the value chain, what are the challenges they're facing, and what is the level of support they need. We have also been promoting supply chain mapping, so ensuring that there are interviews with the local stakeholders, or for example, farmers, local branches of businesses, also to understand what is the environment and the climate in which the investments are going to be happening. Then agree on supporting tailored programmatic interventions to address the main challenges that have been identified in the needs assessments. For example, community dialogue, tool sessions, trainings targeting women in the communities, etc. And then one last thing that probably is quite technical, it's also to take up mandatory ex-ante and ex-post gender impact assessments. I think also Marit mentioned we don't have data on whether Global Gateway projects are doing harm or not. We do believe they should not. But in order to ensure that, so the ex-ante and ex-post assessments and evaluations are really, really important. Another point, and I'm almost finishing, it's about involving civil society organizations in Global Gateway projects. As Marie was mentioning, especially local civil society organizations and women's rights organizations are key in understanding what are the needs of the communities and the best way of delivering on those needs. And that's a call and an ask we have had already for the whole of the youth development cooperation, but especially in this new innovative, if you want, innovative financing and innovative approaches to the youth development cooperation. This is something where it's still under discussion. It's something we would like to see more prominently, obviously, in the next MFF and what comes as next instrument. And then probably one last thing is that, yes, we need to address gender inequalities and we need to ensure the integration also of human development across the board and in different contexts. For that, the EU has a different level of tools. And today what we are seeing is the EU talking more and more about Global Gateway, which might be a very effective tool if it is well adapted to certain contexts where it can actually work. It might not be the case to all the contexts, and the EU counts with other modalities and instruments to do so. So another one of our asks is also to ensure that the tools are actually adapted first to the context, but then also to deliver on the objectives and the impact we want to see in our partner countries, and then that we are able to make the right choice of partners to work with in order to advance those objectives. So I can stop.
Thank you very much, Giulietta. Right, moving now to you, Jennifer. Could you tell us a little bit, or give us a little bit of a taste of how the World Bank is advancing gender budgeting and mainstreaming, particularly in the Eastern Partnership countries, and any thoughts about kind of, what are the key successes so far?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. The World Bank has some experience in gender budgeting, but actually it's probably not as much as many other organizations represented here today. But gender budgeting has been supported through lending operations of the World Bank in Albania, Serbia, North Macedonia, and Ukraine, and also a small technical assistance partnership with UN Women in Moldova. But first, I should explain that the World Bank actually has a tool to ensure that gender equality is concretely and meaningfully addressed in lending operations. It's using a very targeted and project-specific approach to gender mainstreaming called the Gender Tag. So for the 3 years that I've been the gender coordinator in the Europe and Central Asia region, senior management has required that 100% of lending operations are gender tagged. And this means that every project team has to conduct analysis to identify a gender gap that's relevant to the project development objective, design at least one action to narrow or close that gap, and have a rigorous indicator that measures progress in closing the gap during implementation. So in Albania, Serbia, and North Macedonia, gender budgeting helped achieve the gender tag using one type of lending instrument in the bank that's known as a development policy operation, or DPO. And in a DPO, project funds flow after the client country has completed a legal reform or some agreed upon policy change, which is called a prior action. And then the funds flow, and the use of those funds is fairly flexible after that by the ministry that supported the prior action. For example, the $10 million Albania Gender Equality and Access to Economic Opportunities DPO in 2020 was the bank's first DPO to focus entirely on gender. And one of its prior actions was establishing procedures for monitoring gender-related public spending by local governments and integrating gender budgeting into the Albanian financial management information system. There was also a $160 million DPO in Serbia and a $100 million DPO in North Macedonia, and those also had gender responsive budgeting as a prior action. There's another type of lending instrument I'm aware of that has achieved or supported gender budgeting, known as a sort of a results-based financing instrument known as Program for Results, or P4R. And this has been used in Ukraine under a project called, it's a $2 billion project actually, called Supporting Reconstruction Through Smart Fiscal Governance. And its objective is to establish institutional foundations for implementing and financing climate smart recovery and reconstruction at the Ramada level. But it has a disbursement linked indicator requiring local governments to publish gender information on their budgets and service delivery and reconstruction performance. It's ambitious. It aims in 2.5 years to have 400 local governments doing this with gender budgeting from a baseline of 0, and 50% of those local governments, up from 0%, implementing medium-term budgeting that builds on program and gender budgeting methods. So, bank staff working on gender equality in the region have been really inspired to try to replicate these successes. We're now considering proposing a DPO on gender budgeting to the newly formed government in Romania, but for every success, there are many, many failed attempts to convince government counterparts to adopt gender budgeting or make any investment for the sake of gender equality. And the most common type of bank instrument, far more common than DPOs and P4Rs, is investment lending, where a sector-specific operation is prepared in partnership with a line ministry under the approval of the Ministry of Finance. And then funds flow after World Bank board approval, but before any action is taken, because the funds are paying for implementing works directly with human beneficiaries on the ground in project areas. So I think one of the most effective cases of supporting gender budgeting in a client counterpart government is in Ukraine. It actually started out with completely separate from gender budgeting, a $202 million investment lending operation on health that's been under implementation For several years, it tracks, the success of interventions that respond to different needs of male and female beneficiaries and receiving mental health services, rehabilitation services, and other medical and health services. But it also implements and tracks interventions on gender-based violence. And two of its results indicators are the number of primary healthcare personnel trained on GBV case management and the proportion of primary health providers that have at least one staff trained to care for and refer survivors of GBV, with a target of 50%. Because of the close partnership that the bank team and the project implementation unit developed through this project, and this demonstrated successes in achieving some of these targets and indicators, the teams in partnership were able to convince the Ministry of Health to adopt gender responsive budgeting. But it will be more focused on outcomes and than the typical model of gender budgeting, which can lack specifics and accountability for actually improving gender equity and access to services or opportunities through line ministry programming. So I think in addition to, and hopefully strongly complementing gender budgeting, investment lending can be a really powerful and sustainable approach to ensuring that gender inequalities are addressed. Because I think the sector specificity of project innovations on the ground means the project has a much greater chance of actually improving in measurable ways the lives of women and girls and men and boys, as they can also be on the losing ends of gender gaps. And I think the gender tag is an especially effective tool in investment lending because it gets project teams to think about how their operation can be brought to scale and really move the needle on improving a gender outcome. We have in transport, energy, all of these need to achieve the gender tag, but there's a lending envelope there of $2, $4, or $5 billion. It also helps the implementation team think about, in the ministry especially, think about how to make a convincing business case to government decision makers to invest in gender equality. And I would say, one key to success, the most persuasive arguments the bank tends to, and successful arguments the bank presents to country leadership tend to cite the economic argument for investing in women, like the econometric finding that closing the gender gap in paid employment can increase a country's GDP by 11 to 20%, and that healthy women will be able to participate more effectively in the labor force, or women who don't fear being sexually harassed or sexually abused on transportation or a roads project that the World Bank is supporting, they'll also be able to, safely and effectively get to their jobs and work, and that their daughters will be able to be effectively educated and accumulate human capital. So that's been very key.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much. That's really good in hearing some real practical examples there. So sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just a little bit mindful of time and very keen to also bring in the audience here. But thank you very much. That was great to hear. And Sophie, can I just come to you finally? Could you tell us a little bit about, in the face of tightening budgets, what kind of innovative funding models or partnerships do you see as particularly effective in support of gender equality? Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Okay. Thank you all for your brilliant interventions, and I think it's a helpful segue to what I have to add to this discussion. So I think the scale of the recent ODA cuts across Europe, across the US, has certainly been massively alarming. And I think the early conservative estimates that we have of the extent of the cuts is somewhere in the region of and above. And these are very, very early and conservative, are over $700 million to women's rights organizations and feminist movements. And that's across ODA and philanthropy. So all the while, of course, this is merely expanding or widening the existing funding gap for resourcing the SDGs, which at least last year alone stood at $4.3 trillion. And I think historically, for those of us who've worked on gender equality, women's rights issues, we've placed a considerable amount of emphasis on ODA and philanthropy to address some of the biggest global challenges that we see. And of course, international financial architecture reform, which is going to be a big part of the Financing for Development conference in the next couple of weeks, has a notable role to play in addressing, wide systemic issues like tax, trade, debt, etc., all important for unlocking really vital resources. But I think it's also really important to consider the role and the notable and important role of one of the largest sources of international development financing, which is private capital right now. And understandably, for a lot of those working in gender equality, feminist movements, the issue of money is one that comes with huge amount of tension. It's a massively political issue. But in the current geopolitical context that we find ourselves at the moment, it's one that is exceptionally volatile, which is upending, norms on multilateralism, international development cooperation, aid. I think what this is signaling is that we're going to need to think very differently and very creatively about how we address these challenges moving forward, and really moving beyond our existing silos to build this new international financial architecture. So that brings me to kind of explain the Equality Fund as a potential example of an innovative financing model. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, the Equality Fund was established back in 2019 by a $300 million investment from the Canadian government. And at the time, it was a signature initiative as part of its international feminist international assistance policy. So the model, the Equality Fund model, brings together 4 key arms. So it's got an investment arm, philanthropy, grant making, and policy and advocacy work. And so the model is really used to generate long-term sustainable funding through a combination or a variety of these sources that we argue that no one area can fulfill on its own. So the investment arm is a considerable component of the Equality Fund model. And so out of that $300 million that came from the Canadian government, $296 million of that was invested in a bespoke gender lens investment criteria that generates returns every single year to support our global grant making at the Equality Fund. And this is in addition to the money that we also raise through our bilateral partnerships with governments, through philanthropic organizations as well. And the investment portfolio that we have at the Equality Fund is generating a return of about 6% every year at the moment, and currently stands at approximately over $340 million. And that's also considering that we have already given out about over $30 million in grant making since inception. So I think it's an example of how the original seed capital from the Canadian government, that $300 million, is still intact. The principle is still there. We're still able to generate further resources based on a series of investments that we have made, but that are very much gender lens investment through a robust gender lens investment criteria. And in the last 5 years, we have moved $100 million to over 1,000 women's rights organizations in 100 countries. And we hope to continue to build on that over the full 15 years of our partnership with the Canadian government. So I think the Equality Fund model, just to wrap up, is one example, and it's not the only one, of how public investment alongside other forms of capital can be mobilized to support gender equality and address the wider ills. Many of the issues that we heard of and spoke on today, how to address issues around rollback, fights against democratic backsliding, on bodily autonomy, and everything else, the climate crisis and so on. So this is just one of the examples of how we need to think differently to this question around money and resourcing.
Thanks so much, Sophie. That's great to hear. I'd like to open up to the audience. I mean, I've got more questions, but I'm sure there's lots of ideas in the room or reactions to some of the things that we've heard. So, please do raise your hand. Have you got any thoughts on, any of the issues that have been raised today, or any of the questions that the speakers have put forward, or questions to the panel? Please just raise your hand. Oh, yes, here at the front first.
Hi, thank you so much.
Please introduce yourself.
With pleasure. My name is Sandra Malone, and I am with the Elle du Sahel. First of all, magnificent riches you've given all of us, all of the speakers to date. So Thank you so much for that. I'm not sure to whom to ask this, but I kind of want each of your opinions on just one person, post, institution, place where the people just in this room, I mean, virtual room and this one, can go to most effectively advocate and have the changes happen. See what I mean? Yeah.
Great question.
Thank you.
Let's take a couple and then we'll come to the panel.
Good afternoon. My name is Sandra Grignards and I work with MEP Yabira Hasahlani, who's the Vice President of DEVE. So very much, and she's also in FEM, so we are very much focused on exactly what's being discussed today. So thank you so much for all the suggestions and recommendations. And I wanted just to follow up on what Marie said about, and all of you talked about reaching women-led organizations, women rights organizations, and so on. How would you see that EU could do that better? Like what mechanisms or instruments, or like how can we actually get that channeled to the local, like the grassroots, both in, of course, on the humanitarian side, but also on the development side? Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I think there was one more over here.
Hi, thank you. Saoirse Gabizon, Women Engaged for a Common Future. I'm also in the, what is it called? Advisory platform of civil society and local authorities on the Global Gateway. And I just walked out of a global meeting organized by DJ INPA, where we also talked about MFF and the Global Gateway and gender equality. And I am concerned. I'm very concerned with the upcoming MFF negotiations that we are maybe looking at very big cuts, grant cuts, that there will be still funding, but that it will maybe a lot the loans and guarantees for private sector investments in the Global Gateway, but that the very essential funding we have over the thematic programs, which you mentioned, that the very essential instrument of the gender equality marker and the target for that, the 85% target, which you mentioned and which you would like to improve even further, that these are under threat. So what are we going to do to make sure that we are not losing this essential grant funding? I do understand the mixing and that you can have and loan funding and then also have some grant funding, as you explained with the Equality Fund. But I think that now, with all the cuts we have heard about, you were talking about 700 million euros just lost recently because of the cuts of USAID, the UK, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Sweden, they have all been cutting their grant funding. We have a report from UN Women that 90% of the women's organizations are about to collapse because of this, right? We urgently need more grant funding from the EU, more, not less. But of course, in the current situation, how are we going to convince the MEPs and the Council of Ministers to come forward on this? So what can we do together? Thanks.
Thank you very much. All excellent questions. And I've got one extra to add to the group, which is who do you think the EU should be putting pressure on diplomatically to also step up their role in terms of gender equality funding? So, you know, particularly at the upcoming conference, but also more broadly, are there countries that you think could be playing a much bigger role than they are at the moment? Great. So who would like to start? I see Maris has unfortunately had to drop off. I know, Marie, you've got to go first. So would you like to come in first?
Sure. And I think if I had the perfect answer for all the questions, yeah, we wouldn't be in that situation, I guess. On who to speak to, that's a very difficult question. My 2 cents would be that von der Leyen is taking a lot of the power. Would she listen to us on gender equality? Not sure, but I think she might be one of the persons we want to target, especially as the EPP seems to be much more difficult in the parliament, and she might have some influence there. So that would be the person, if there was one person we should target, I would try with her. I don't think I would be successful though, but you know, maybe all together.
Different
Yeah.
attitude. Gotta do it.
On how to improve things to make sure that funding goes to women's rights organizations. Well, that's tricky because there's like an ideal, you know, response, and there's also the reality we work in. I think there. If I can just, you know, like think of one solution, I think EU delegations would probably want to have the resources to be able to fund more women's rights organizations. But the rules of the EU are very complicated, so that would be one thing to change to make sure that the EU delegations are actually able to fund local women's rights organizations. But they would also have to have more like human resources. I think they are very much understaffed, and it's very difficult for them to actually have small contracts, because if you do contracts with local women's rights organizations, you can't ask them, not necessarily at least, to implement a 1 million project. So you would need to have the human resources to be able to have several smaller projects, and we're not going into that direction. So this is also something we should look at, the kind of changes in the EU delegations and the way they are set up that were announced, and then we don't know really where that is going. But I think that's one point to look at.
Thank you.
And I will have to leave now.
No, thank you so much for joining us. It's been wonderful having you here. And I think the delegation point is a really interesting one, and should be also part of the MFF discussion. It's not just the Global Gateway that should be framing our kind of focus areas, but really looking at the wider external action sort of offer. Can I come to you next, Giulietta? Any thoughts?
Yes, I have a couple of thoughts. So probably in addition to President von der Leyen, to talking to President von der Leyen, I think it's becoming very, very important that we reach out to our own leaders in our own governments in EU member states in the upcoming negotiations, but also in the upcoming summit in Sevilla in a couple of weeks. It is also their decision, and then if we manage to convince them that gender equality is important, that investing in gender equality is important, they can make it happen, even if President von der Leyen is not that convinced of it. But yeah, I think that's also another actor we should be talking with more and more strongly. Yes, I think Marie already started providing an answer to how can the EU channel funds to women-led and women's rights organizations better. I think this is an ask we have been having also for several years in the different coalitions we have been part of, that we would like to see more direct funding to local women's rights and women-led organizations. But then obviously for that, we do understand it's difficult to access the funds, it's difficult to implement them, it's difficult to report on that. So actually we do agree that we also need simplified procedures in order to do that. And you might tell me, okay, the EU, yeah, you have a lot of administrative burdens, you have a lot of rules that we need to follow. We do follow them as civil society organizations, yet there are global commitments, or commitments at global level, at UN level as well, to simplify all these procedures and rules and reporting mechanisms. So something we're also asking is that to ensure there is alignment between those commitments and then what actually happens in the reality of calls for proposals or implementation of projects, etc. So that's another point. And then you ask a tricky question. Who should the EU be pushing? I think it's a tricky question. I think we are in a global movement where a lot of actors should need to push to one another. I don't have one specific actor. I think we're living now in a multipolar world, and unfortunately, bad examples or not very positive examples are followed by others. We talk a lot about leading by example, and actually the EU has a strong commitment on leading by example. So we would like to see that instead, rather than only taking the bad examples that other parts of the world are taking in this multipolar world, we have an EU that keeps on being strong and leading by examples and trying to achieve their own commitments. So, but yeah, I don't. It's not a very clear answer. More.
No, that's great. It's a hard question, I know. So thank you very much. Sophie, can I come to you next?
So a couple of thoughts. So the first question on one place we can go to advocate to deliver change. I think, yes, depending on what change you're looking for, there are obviously a variety of different places that you can go. But I think really to feed on what you said, Julieta, we are currently in a very hostile global context, and multilateralism is dying. But at the same time, it is an opportunity to really reframe the ways in which multilateralism can work, and make sure that we're centering our own demands as part of those negotiations and conversations, and so on. So I do think that is, there are a variety of multilateral forums that are taking place right now. So those are the places that we might want to invest a lot of our energy whilst these new frontiers are being developed and built. And then the question on how to convince MEPs on MFF and beyond. So I think at the moment, many of you will have seen, and we've experienced it quite viscerally, that we're having to make very strong economic arguments to justify spending on gender equality and investing in gender equality, which I think to build on that, I think we can see really, really strong alignment with achieving gender equality alongside the EU's strategic priorities across the world. There is a clear link there, and I think we can make really strong arguments as to the future of the EU and its long-term sustainability and longevity, that there has to be investment in gender equality, because that is the kind of change that happens at the local level, that is transformative, that can deliver change. And so I think that there is a big effort and push that we can make in that regard. And on the point on who should the EU be pushing, some thoughts, and not because I'm based in the UK, but for example, the Financing for Development Forum that's coming up in the next couple of weeks. The UK has an immense role to play within the international tax system, for example, which is vital for unlocking key resources. And that's one of the key arguments that some of our grantee partners make, and will be coming to lobby governments at the Financing for Development conference on. The others, another key one to look out for is countries that are still continuing to prioritize and advocate for a feminist foreign policy, which I know seems really off and bizarre in the middle of 2025 when we see some of the huge amounts of regression around the world. But for example, the newest German international development minister has made a commitment to reviewing Germany's feminist foreign policy. And it is a potential, it feels like an outlier right now, but it's a silver lining that there are still some countries that are choosing to or will continue to prioritize that. And that can be the entry point for our continued discussions on advancing gender equality through a lot of foreign policy discussions and negotiations. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sophie. And finally, Jennifer, can I come to you? Any thoughts on the questions?
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll just be brief in case there are more questions from the audience. So regarding getting more funding and support to women's organizations, at least in terms of World Bank operations, are critical, not because funds don't flow directly to them, but as implementing partners or partners of lead implementing agencies. They know the entire landscape and have deep roots in communities to understand, what the gender norms are there, especially, regressive gender norms that may be holding women back from participating in paid labor, may keep an enormous care burden on women, and with that expectation that they, do all the caregiving for children and elderly in the household. And also, these are norms that underlie, justification and acceptance of gender-based violence. So in Moldova, for example, it's been very helpful we've been in partnership with UN Women there in Moldova, but they've put us in touch with some NGOs that respond to or provide holistic GBV survivor-centered services to GBV survivors in Moldova, mostly women and girls, including Ukrainian refugees who are based in Moldova. And it's, we've been able to design a pretty robust project that the government is interested in eventually scaling up because it has the participation and backing of UN Women and these local organizations that have been working to address GBV in local communities for decades. And I think that, any way that the EU can, there can be partnerships where the bank is collaborating with EU on, how to identify these local organizations or top up funding on lending operations. That would be, that's a way to bring more of these organizations into the activities and, they get funded to do these activities. On who the EU could be putting pressure on diplomatically to step up gender equality funding, I do think that the EU Acquis is a very powerful tool to leverage more commitment to gender equality from candidate countries. And we're hearing more and more staff like me in the World Bank from country directors and regional management to link lending operation activities to helping governments achieve EU Acquis requirements. So in terms of the EU Gender Acquis, how can the bank help them, support them in passing laws that effective or put into effect some of the gender directives for the EU Gender Acquis? It always depends on, the government counterparts have to be willing, and sometimes they're not. I won't name names, but this happened in Moldova with the DPO and a certain minister. But, once these legal reforms are achieved and funds flow, it's also important to be able to convince government counterparts to follow up development policy operations with lending operations that actually can ensure that the legal changes are implemented and enforced. Thanks.
Great, thanks ever so much, Jennifer. That's great. Are there any final questions? And if not, oh, actually there are. So let's have that. Here you go. Sorry. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for this insights and for organizing this wonderful discussion. I am Alice Barlam. I am a student and also work with the youth engagement group of the G20 on inclusive social development and fighting inequality. And my question is, looking at this room, how can we get everyone on board on this? Because why is there so many women interested in this topic? Where are the men? How can we get everyone in society to see this as a interest and priority? Because that's when the budgeting comes in, when the interest is there. So would you have any ideas on how we can spread awareness? Thank you very much.
Great question. Any thoughts from any of our panelists?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. It's a very important question. And yes, on that, obviously, when we talk about advancing gender equality, we talk about advancing equality for everybody. That also includes, not only like we focus and we talk a lot about our role in society and women's roles in society and how to advance that, but that also includes having a process of working with men and boys across the board and actually be clear that when we're talking about gender equality, it's for everybody. So I think we haven't mentioned this in our interventions. So yes, I thank you for the for the reminder. I think in our case, or I can mention probably some examples of this kind of work that I have seen in my current position, but also in my previous life and positions. And I can mention some examples in Central America when we are supporting women who suffer from gender-based violence. So on one side, we are providing services to support them, to support the survivors of gender-based violence, but then at the same time, we need to work with the communities and then with men and boys in those communities for example, in Latin America, we talk a lot about new masculinities and new masculinities approach in order to ensure that violence against women and girls gets reduced. So this has been happening across different regions. So I think this is, something we probably need to improve ourselves even here.
Great, thank you very much. Sophie, any thoughts?
Nothing to specifically add on that, because it is an intensely difficult question to answer, because yes, of course, gender equality is not just about advancing women's rights, and there is a role for everybody to play in that work. And I think sometimes we often have to make arguments for men to consider the role of consider the importance of gender equality by linking it to their own personal experiences of, their mothers, their wives, their children, and so on, which is not an argument I'm particularly favorable of. But there is something to say about the importance of advancing gender equality to achieve wider ambitions and wider goals that we have across the world, and that it cannot be achieved in isolation, and that there is actually a role for everybody to play as part of that, that work. So I could continue to say that that's the way in which we have to continue pitching the need for getting men on board on the gender equality conversation.
Thank you. And Jennifer, I can see you nodding. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I very much agree with both comments. And I don't mean to harp too much on the economic argument. I actually was trained as a sociologist. But again, the business case for anything, whatever the objective is, you get people on board by showing them how the objective can be better achieved by being more gender inclusive. And that, goes for discussions with heads of state, all the way down to working with families and communities to, when we do awareness raising activities in community-driven development and livelihoods focused projects. In Europe and Central Asia, there's it's imperative to work with men and actually typically male leaders of communities to get them to understand that, if a woman can earn income outside of the household, it's going to benefit everybody in the household, and it's going to benefit the community. And then you bring that argument, up many levels to heads of state to, and I cite that statistic I used earlier, that GDP is going to increase measurably if more women are brought into the labor force, because there are still remarkably large gender gaps in some Europe and Central Asia countries. And, without doing that, it's, women can be at the center of economic growth and development and poverty reduction. And it takes, it's really helpful if we can arm country directors and country leaders with talking points when they speak to government leaders. And I have an example of this, but I don't want to take up too much more time. So we can come back to that if I don't have more time.
Well, I think actually we're kind of due to wrap up, Jennifer, if that's okay. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been really fantastic to have you here. And a huge thanks to you both for joining the panel. Can I have a round of applause for our fantastic panel? So I think I will wrap up there. I think, that's been a really fascinating discussion for me. I've learned a lot. I think we've learned, just how urgent the situation is globally, but also the situation here in the discussions around the MFF and the future of European programming around the Global Gateway, for example. The real need to be making the case for why it's so important to be addressing this vast gap in funding and the missed opportunities that are opportunities that are going to be missed in terms of not having the enabling impact of funding gender equality. I thought there were some really great points and concrete actions identified in terms of targets, and ways of working that need to be taken on board in terms of those discussions. And it was really useful to hear from you, Jennifer, in terms of the realities of working on the ground, and from you, Sophie, in terms of the way the Equality Fund approaches these things differently. And I hope that we can kind of start sharing these examples more and more in thinking about the kind of future approach to programming. And then finally, I think we touched on, narratives, advocacy targets and things like that. And again, for me, that's been very helpful in thinking about how we prioritise our work over the coming months. Yeah, so over the next few months, obviously we've got the MFF coming up, so there'll be a lot of discussion and debate. Here for the gender talks, we will have one in the autumn, but also for ODI Europe, we will have a big report coming up called A Case for Development, which is where we're looking at new narratives for aid in the context of the EU strategic agenda. We've also got a tool coming out that my colleague Aline has been working on, which will help donors to reduce the risks of unintentionally funding anti-gender actors through foreign aid. So it's a real practical tool for funders to use. And then after the summer break, we will also have a report looking at the GAP3 and the EU's and how to support the EU's support for gender equality and how that can be strengthened. So do look out for those. Thank you so much once again for coming. We've got drinks and things outside. I hope you can stay for a bit of a chat. And otherwise, we will see you here again in autumn. A big thank you to my colleagues, Aline, Youssef, Flannery and Nerea, and to the UN Women team who have been absolutely fantastic. Florence, Lillian, Sophie, Yulia and Vishnia. Thank you again. Thanks.
Yes, good.